which we were trying to figure out earlier what that meant. He's Mike Ellis, and he's a university instructor.
Off and on.
And he said it's probably hurt him that he's become a libertarian in the last couple of years. So maybe talk a little bit about how you found out about us and what changed your mind.
Really, that was way off topic.
Well, at least start with that.
No, but it would be interesting. It's always a pretty human touch to your talk.
Human touch.
How
I'm not really
the
good at
social
improvising.
Michael, welcome.
Okay, thank you, Paul. Thank you all, one and all, for coming, laying down your hard-earned shekels and sacrificing your Saturday night. I appreciate it. Okay, so I'm going to try and improvise and respond to the request to say something about myself before I begin. I spent most of my life as a leftist of one kind or another. I was actually a Leninist for about 6 months at one point, became gradually disenchanted with that. In the 90s, I sort of drifted towards postmodernism, which is where Marxists go to hide after the fall of the Soviet Union. Then, after 9/11, for 5 years, I think I was a neoconservative, or at least I tried to be a neoconservative anyways. I went and read all the Irving Kristol and Norman Horowitz and all that stuff, and it was, they're actually interesting thinkers because they're all Trotskyists, really, if we come right down. They're all Jacobins, in fact. They're Jacobins. You study the French Revolution, conservatives are Jacobins. But anyways. And then I was like, there was this show called Uncommon Knowledge, I don't know if you're familiar with it. It has a lot of neoconservatives on it. And I was watching this one day, and they had Richard Epstein on, sort of anarchist, libertarian, legal scholar. And I thought, this guy's interesting, So I started reading his stuff. This is about 3 years ago. So I started reading his stuff, and gradually I sort of inched my way, because he kind of likes Hayek a little bit, so that got me to read Hayek, and then from that I sort of got Mises and this sort of thing, and wound my way. And Paul was disappointed to know that the big moment came. I was actually sitting on my beautiful little porch in my little place in Thailand where I go over the pool. I can picture it now perfectly. And I was reading, and I'd read several essays by Rothbard at this point, and I kind of like, I don't know. But then I was reading the essay he wrote for the Cato Journal on neutral taxation. And like halfway through this essay, it's like, the scales fall from your eyes, and oh Christ, I understand now. And ever since then, I've been corrupted, and I can't get a job anymore at university. But that's okay. I don't mind. So that's a little background. So for remarks tonight, I had something particular I wanted to talk to you about. It may be a little different, from what's done in the past. I don't know, but it's something that I've been paying a lot of attention to recently, trying to get a better grasp on, and I thought it might be time to share it with others, so you can give me some feedback. So there is actually a paper I've written. It's a draft, but it's a respectable draft. So if anything I say tonight is of interest to you, by all means, email me, and I'll happily send you a copy of the paper, and you can get feedback if you so. But I will say that the topics on which I'm going to be discussing, I do not pretend to be an expert. I'm a dilettante working in secondary sources, so if at the end you want to ask me some, sophisticated question about nuances of medieval historiography or something, I probably won't be able to answer it. But I'll give it a try. And I don't know how you normally work it, but it would be easier for me if you just let me talk, and then questions and criticisms and comments and jury can all be kept to the end, because I will lose my train of thought. I predict right now I'll lose my train of thought at least 3 times. But if we're having lots of talking, then I'll never finish this at all. So time to is that it? I think that's all my preparatory remarks. Okay, so as you know, the theme of the remarks is the myth of the social contract. And I wanted to start off by clarifying what I mean by that. I mean what I call the implicit social contract. Because you probably most of you know, in political philosophy, there's social contract tradition associated to Thomas Hobbes and John Locke and these people. And that will come up in what I have to say. But that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about this idea, and we've all encountered it, I'm sure, and most of you have probably been at this longer than me, or more adept than I in dealing with it when you encounter it. But this people whom have this assumption that somehow society is kind of a superorganism, that we're all somehow part of this, whether we like it or not. And most of these people, I don't think have ever heard of Thomas Hobbes. Most of them aren't familiar with the idea that in philosophy there's something called social contract theory, and yet they hold this idea somehow implicitly that society is a superorganism, that somehow we're all part of this collective. So I started off with wanting, as part of a larger project to try and understand the state. What I really want to do is write a book on the state. But it occurred to me that this is a major obstacle to try and get people to think critically about the state. And I wanted to understand what lies underneath or behind this assumption of the implicit social contract, and how does it tie together with the idea of the state. And this has taken me back into history, which after all is my domain. So this is the topic I'd like to share with you tonight. So as kind of a forewarning or foreshadowing, like our literary illusions, I would say, when we get to the end of this, maybe you'll find that when you encounter people who make this argument, if those people are religious, or better still Christians, then in a certain sense I think you have to give them good deal. Now I don't mean that you concede the argument to them. They still, the burden of proof is still on them to prove that this social organism exists in a material way. It's not just projecting on their fantasy, but they're being logically consistent. However, the people you encounter who make this argument are secularists or atheists, well then they're engaging in a sort of laughable self-contradiction in terms of their own intellectual framework that they don't understand. Because what I want to try and convey to you is my growing belief. Like I said, this is all still in the process, but I'm becoming increasingly convinced that where this all begins is with Christian theology. And the way in which certain doctrines from Christian theology were smuggled into political philosophy and legal theory during particularly during the medieval era into the later medieval era. And then how these ideas have been adapted to changing historical circumstances leading up to the situation where we are today. So this is the situation, this is what you're going to be confronted with. So I hope you're ready for it. Buckle up. So the particular Christian doctrine that's important here is what's called the two bodies of Christ. So early Christian theologians developed this idea that Christ had two bodies. I'll briefly touch on some of the reasons for this, but there's more to it. This idea that Christ has two bodies. On the one hand, Christ has a natural body, the body of a flesh and blood human being. This guy Jesus, right, was born in Nazareth, carpenter, child of Mary and Lady Joseph, I don't know. But this is just a flesh and blood body, the human body. And this body can perish. It can suffer and it can die, presumably, all of which happened to Christ on the cross. And yet, interestingly enough, Christ can come back, presumably. I know there's disputes in Christian doctrine about this, but I think most Christians believe that at the end of days, Christ will return, and he'll be in a different natural body. It won't be the body of Jesus. That's gone, right? That turned to dust a long time ago, right? So he'll be in a different natural body. But this is funny because, I mean, for Christian explanation of this, I mean, we can't fall back on reincarnation, right? Because believe in reincarnation. We're not strictly talking about a soul, because everyone has a soul, but not everyone can do that. So how is it possible that Christ can do this? Well, the reason he can do it is because he continues to live in the world despite the death of the natural body, and he lives in the world because he has this second body, which they call the mystical body of Christ. Now, the mystical body of Christ in addition to allowing Christ to inhabit yet another natural body at the end of days, had the additional, and for our purposes much more important benefit of manifesting itself in the world through the bringing together of all Christians into a single Christendom. And this idea was that all Christians, from the very beginning, because of course they believed they were Christians before Christ, that's why they got the Old Testament in there in the Bible, right? Up to the very present day. So all Christians, past and present, in all places at all times, are bound together in the mystical body of Christ. So what happens here is this notion of the mystical body of Christ turns Christianity into a form of collective unity. Everyone is bound together into this single body. The language of body is, as we'll see, becomes very important. So what happens there? Actually, along the way, I'll mention, if anyone's actually interested in this, I'll mention some fascinating books that I discovered along the way. One book that really blew me away is by Ernest Kantorowicz called The King's Two Bodies. And this massive, detailed book, he goes with great precision, goes through the story of how the canonists and jurists of the middle medieval era took these ideas of the two bodies of Christ and smuggled them into political philosophy and legal theory for the specific ends of serving the power ambitions of the medieval kings. Now, this was possible to do in part. This was possible to do in part because there was a kind of spectrum in place in which it became slippery along the spectrum as to where Christ and kings stood exactly. I mean, Christ was clearly closer to humans than God was because Christ had been in a human body. Right? But the kings were also considered kind of closer to God than humans were. And if you look at the iconography of the time, the symbolism, right? It's easy to make this kind of slippery association because it becomes common to refer to Christ as being the King of Christendom. And you'd see pictures of him, sitting on his throne in heaven, wearing his crown, not the crown of thorns, of course, but when he's on his throne in heaven, he's wearing a great crown of gems and so forth, right? This kind of thing. So he looks and is regarded as a king, and even a lot of the symbolism, like the sun, the rays of light emitting from the back of the head in paintings and this kind of thing, right? And by the 13th century, we find references to the kings as Christos, which mean God-men. So the idea that they're almost like gods, or they're kind of like God's representative of the secular world, or something like this. So this kind of slipperiness becomes possible. So what happens is that the jurists start evolving this idea that, in fact, as the kings are in some ways almost meeting Christ in sort of the middle of the spectrum, that it's reasonable to think that the king too would have two bodies. And so they start evolving. This takes about 300 years for this thing to go through the full evolution, but to cut a long story short. Again, we find the king has a natural body, okay, just like Christ, but this the flesh and blood man who sits on the throne, right? But this body can perish, it can die, right? But of course, the king never really dies, right? He can embody another flesh and blood body, which with time comes to be his heirs, right? This idea that somehow the son of the king would naturally become the king, this was not, through most of the medieval period, this wasn't assumed. This took the importation of the mystical body doctrine, the two bodies doctrine, into legal theory to establish this as a legal principle. And so this idea that the king, that the son of the king would take over, it's not that he's the son of the king, he's still the king. And the medieval toast, which I think a lot of people now think of as like a Monty Python joke or something, but it's really, the king is dead, long live the king. Medieval people meant this quite seriously. The natural body of the king has died, but the king still lives on. in his heirs, in his line, right? Now, of course, through the same arrangement. Well, how does the king do this? Right? Well, because the king is always there in some sense, because the king too has a mystical body, and the mystical body serves the same purpose for the kingdom in legal and philosophical terms as the mystical body of Christ served for Christendom. Now, to really appreciate what's going on here, we have to take a few steps back and understand what these kings were dealing with prior to the successful smuggling of this two-body doctrine into political philosophy and legal theory. And this is just, I have to, Paul urged me at one point to try and be controversial. Maybe I can make some parenthetic remarks that might be a little controversial, I don't know. I think it's really a shame that so many libertarian scholars have just followed in line with Rothbard's really inadequate, verging on uncritical embrace of Franz Oppenheimer's thesis in his book, The State. Now, if you don't know this book, if you read Rothbard, he refers to it, whenever he talks about the state, he brings up Oppenheimer's thesis pretty much. So Oppenheimer's thesis was that the rise of agriculture led to sedentary human settlement. And because humans were now settled in one place, rather than just being, hunter-gatherer nomads, it became easier for others, these marauding plainsmen, to pillage and plunder them. They were easier to find. You knew where they were, right? They couldn't go away because they were growing crops, right? They had to settle down. And eventually, they wise up and say, well, because maybe they come back to pillage and plunder, and someone's already been there and pillaged and plundered, right? So they finally decide to sort of set up camp permanently and just exploit these people on a permanent basis. And Oppenheimer says, this is the emergence of the state. This is where the state begins. And Rothbard pretty much follows this. I think this is ridiculous. This is utterly ridiculous. I mean, first of all, the fact is that Oppenheimer has a bunch of important things wrong. And we can't really fault him because at the time he wrote, he didn't know this. Like, since the 90s, it's been clear from archaeological evidence that the relationship's the other way around. It was not agriculture that led to sedentary settlement. It was sedentary settlement that eventually gave rise to agriculture. It's like hundreds of years in between the two, actually. And that actually is important, but I'm not going to go into that. See, I told you I'd lose my train of thought 3 times. Okay, that's my first thing. Yeah. Okay, the two things that really bother me about that thesis is first, they take all these things, like all these different forms of, let's say, governance, right? I mean, marauding, predatory marauders and warlords and chieftains and bands of elders and kingdoms and empires and free cities and constitutional monarchies and representative government, call it all the state. I mean, this is meaningless. This makes the word state a useless word. It's of no value at all. And it has an unfortunate theoretical impact, too, is it just kind of feeds into those statists who will say, oh, well, the state's always existed, or at least it's always existed ever since humans lived in highly dense, sedentary settlements kind of thing. Well, no. I mean, yeah, if you use the word state that way, but that's ridiculous to use it that way. I think you have to be sensitive to the sometimes quite substantial historical differences between these different kinds of ways of arranging, even if they all are in some sense, and I would grant Oppenheimer, in some sense they're all kind of exploitative, extractive type institutions. But to call them all the state, I think, is misguided. I think actually, I think it was Machiavelli who first coined the phrase "the state" in the sense that we use it. Right? It had been used before, but it was kind of like a synonym for condition. So people refer to the state of the realm as in, a report to the king on the state of the realm in the eastern counties or some such thing, right? Machiavelli is the first one who uses it as kind of like an abstract institution of governance. And of course, most historians would say that it's since the Westphalian Treaty, the early 17th century, I think, where the state first, in practical terms, becomes the dominant form of social organization. So I think realistically, the state is like 400 to 500 years old in the terms that in the sense in which we use it. So what makes this possible is this importation of the two bodies doctrine. We understand this better if we look at what they confronted before, which is where I got sidetracked. So most of this period, of the medieval period, what these kings confronted was what we usually call feudalism. Now, I bet if I asked most of you to define feudalism, and before I did this reading, it would be true of me too, you probably define it in terms of a land tenure system, right? We talk about nobles and serfs and manors and fiefdoms and land divided up and, this kind of thing, right? But it's kind of funny because, the root word feud, it doesn't seem to have anything to do with land tenure at all. But yet it's a perfect word if you want to understand the governance system of the society. And this was the dominant form throughout most of Europe, most of the place, most of the time during the medieval era. So if when you were in high school or something, right, your history teacher probably said, well, feudalism, there were all these wars, everyone was fighting wars, which is true. But the legal scholars of the time were very specific about distinguishing between wars and feuds. Wars were eternal. Feuds were something unique to this society. Now, so basically you had hierarchies of fealty, right? Where you had the square fealty up, to a noble, up to the king, or to the baron, up to the king, or whatever, right? This kind of thing. Wars took place between these hierarchies of fealty. Feuds took place within them. Now here's the thing. In theory, anyone, the lowest commoner, in theory, though not really in practice, but in practice, any noble who had the means could take up arms against his king, provided he had rightful cause in terms of a violation of his rights as determined by natural law. And no legal scholar said this was treason. It was not treason to take up arms against the king if you had a rightful cause. You imagine that under the state. Is there any cause for which you can take up arms against the government of Canada? Of course not. There is no cause. And this is what changes as a consequence of the importation of the two bodies doctrine, and particularly the effect of the mystical body doctrine. If the entire kingdom is a collective unity, bound together, everyone part of this same unit, then it's no longer legitimate to take up arms against the king, because you take up arms against the entire society, against the entire kingdom. But this is not the way feudalism works. In feudalism, in a very real sense, you could talk about it as being a polyarchy, right? I'm not saying the polyarchy meaning just like multiple forms of power or multiple forms of authority. Now, they weren't all equal, of course, but given the right circumstances, anyone could declare an authority that superseded that of the king if they were done harm by the king. Now, the whole, I won't go into this, but I mean the whole legal structure of this era is really built around how you deal with feuds. What are the right conditions to which you can institute a feud? What is the process? You'd have to petition the king 3 times, and if you need the satisfaction, you have to ask third parties intervening on your behalf. There's this whole process that went on. But the whole legal structure was built around how do you deal with feuds. So this, you understand, is a totally different situation than what we think of the king and the sort of the cliche model of monarchy. Monarchy only becomes possible if you get rid of all this polarchy. If you get rid of this idea that everyone is justified to make a reasonable, rightful claim against the king. Only when the king becomes all-powerful do you actually have monarchy, and this only becomes possible when it becomes culturally and politically illegitimate to take up arms against the king, because you're now taking up arms against the entire body politic. Now, So I mean, that's the core story. Of course, there's more we can say about it, but I think that gives you the basic idea of how the notion of an implicit social contract first begins to take form in the medieval era and evolves into monarchy. Now, it goes through several interesting steps along the way between there and us, which are worth saying a few words about. The next really important thing is the development of the idea of sovereignty. Now, it's actually probably also Machiavelli who was the first real theorist of sovereignty, though he doesn't ever actually use the term, but you're probably all at least vaguely familiar with his urging of his prince, that the prince should disregard natural law, disregard canon law, disregard the Gospels, should not be tied down in any way in terms of exercising his power. His power has to be ultimate, right? It has to be absolute. This is where the term absolutism ultimately comes from, right? This idea of the king, of the mystical body of the king, and the king ruling absolutely, right? But it was really a fellow named Jean Bodin, a French philosopher, who was the first real great philosopher who explicitly talked about sovereignty. And he's very clear about what sovereignty is. To be sovereign is to be apart, separate, and above. Now, on the face of it, that seems obviously necessary, right? So, I mean, this king is sovereign in relationship to the people and the law. He has to be above it, because how else can he make the law? Who is he to proclaim the law for everyone else if he is subject to the law the same as everyone else? So he can't be an equal under the law of everyone else. He has to be above everyone to whom he gives the law. He has to be above the law itself. How else can he change the law, right? He can't change the law. If he's subject to the law, then he'd be breaking the law. He can't have that. That's ridiculous, right? So you can't do that. So he's got to be above the people, and he's got to be above the law. Now, there is a kind of funny logical problem there. I don't know if you see it right away, right? But I mean, on the one hand, the unity of the kingdom, the collective unity is created by the king's mystical body. So how can the king be above his own mystical body, right? Above, separate, and apart from his own mystical body? It seems like a bit of a problem, and they work pretty hard to fix it. Because he does it. He has a natural body, right? He is a single man, so in a sense he can stand apart in a certain sense. I don't find it entirely convincing, but they found it worked for them. Now, the two figures then who we have to, in closing here, I'll mention two figures whom sort of bring us to the modern day, and I think start sketching out a picture of this that will seem more familiar to us. The first, of course, is Thomas Hobbes. We can never have these discussions without Thomas Hobbes. Hobbes largely shared, he pretty much entirely shared Bodin's definition of sovereignty, and he also agreed with Bodin that the sovereign should be a single natural body, should be a king, right? However, he granted the possibility that it didn't necessarily have to be. And in Leviathan, his famous book, where he propounds all this, frequently when he refers to the sovereign, he defines it as a man or an assembly of men. And to my knowledge, it's the first time anyone talks about sovereignty as being divisible. That it doesn't have to be one natural body person, a king. That sovereignty can in fact be spread widely among many people, a group of people, an assembly. What does an assembly actually mean? Does it mean, a group of people who assemble, or it means the assemblage of all people? So people started thinking, and started interpreting Hobbes' suggestion is that, well, Hobbes would prefer the sovereign to be a king. Maybe an aristocracy can be sovereign. Maybe a democracy can be sovereign, right? So these are thoughts that had not been raised before, prospects that had not been considered before. The other important thing, of course, that Hobbes contributes is that for him, this is a covenant, is his word. It's a covenant. So all these prior sovereignty theorists, Machiavelli and Bodin and Voltaire and Farmer, all these guys, had all treated sovereignty as a natural fact. It grew out of the nature of the king as a representative of God. But Hobbes says that in fact, and he's very explicit about this, that sovereignty comes from the people giving voice to their own willful act of suspending their own power, giving it to the sovereign. And this is where the idea of the social contract comes from. So the idea is that the sovereign is created, has all the powers of the sovereign, above a party separate, above the law, above the people, but it's created by the people. Does it sound familiar? Okay. So this is, I think you make a legitimate case that the modern world is actually born in the pages of Leviathan. And he really, lays down the framework for what becomes the modern state, modern governance. The second person we have to look at, well, as a consequence of, well, maybe, no, I don't overstate it. In tandem with Hobbes' opening up of the prospect that sovereignty can be possessed in an aristocracy or in a democracy, or in the divisible in some way. We have the development that begins really, I guess, in the 17th century, but becomes huge in the 18th century, is this growing idea that, well, if sovereignty can be divisible, then why not divisible among everybody, right? So the idea of the people as sovereign, popular sovereignty, in the late 18th century, of course, this intellectual life in Europe is full of this kind of talk. The American and French revolutions are full of this kind of talk. We the people, right? All this kind of thing. But I put it to you, if it was a little odd that the king, who's supposed to, mystical body, ties the whole kingdom together, it's a little odd how he was also simultaneously going to be, above, apart and separate from his own mystical body. That's a little weird, but they tried to work around that. But if that's a little weird, how is it at all possible that the people, all the people, can be collectively above, apart, and separate from themselves? I mean, what can that possibly mean? This seems, on the face of it, to be an absurdity. Sadly. This very case was all too convincingly, and I think rather tragically, made by Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And he largely is responsible for the popularity of this idea, because this is exactly what he argues in The Social Contract, his famous book on this, is that the people all together embody a collective sovereignty that is indeed above them. And no individual, no group of individuals are justified in speaking against this. It's a mystical body. He doesn't use the term the mystical body, but that's what he's talking about, the mystical body of the people, because it transcends any individual. It transcends any group of individuals. If maybe you remember your Rousseau from college or anything, you know what I'm talking about is what Rousseau calls the general will. The general will is basically Rousseau's word for the sovereignty of the mystical body. But of course, that creates a problem, right? If no individual and no group of individuals can actually speak for the general will, right? Because other people say, no, I say it says this, well, I say it says this, I say, well, it transcends all these different opinions, right? That's the whole point. So how can this sovereignty act in the world? How can it have any effectiveness in the world? No individual can represent it. I mean, a king, we know who to go to, right? We know who says what's what, right? Who says what's what if all the people are collectively sovereign? The state. The state, which is not a person. The state is not a person. No one is the state. Lots of people work for the state. Nobody is the state. It is the state as this abstract institution that somehow represents the general will, that represents the sovereignty of the mystical body of the people. And now this should be sounding very familiar to you, right? In fact, I think, I sort of threw this in the paper. I don't really involved. I think there's an interesting case that the child of Rousseau might be Franz Kafka. You're familiar with the writing of Franz Kafka. He's very often, not always, but often writes these stories about these poor little persecuted guys. They're just getting the runaround by the state. They don't know what's going on. The trial is the famous one, where this guy's just constantly being processed all the time. And there's always some new sort of faceless, nameless bureaucrat who's processing him, and he can't find out, what he's charged with, or if he's been charged of anything, or what he can do to end this process. Kind of like it's kind of that. It's kind of like Rousseau's picture of the state. Because in the old, with Hobbes and Baudin, we could go to the king, right? You want mercy, you want justice, you go to the king. He may say no, but at least you know who to talk to, right? In Rousseau's world, there is no one really, right? No one ultimately has the authority. Everyone kind of works for someone else in some sense, right? So that's kind of the world of the state that I think Rousseau takes us. So I'm hoping that from this brief survey of massive swaths of history, you can see what I'm getting at is that it seems to me that when people are talking about this idea of the implicit social contract, this idea that we're all, in it together, and you know what I'm talking about this, right? Certain sacrifices have to be made for the social good, certain actions have to be taken for the social interest, or the we statements, the we statements, right? That we've decided that everyone needs universal health care, or we stole the land from the Indians, or public debt doesn't matter because we owe it to ourselves, and all this kind of, as though, we're all part, we're all in this together, and you don't have a choice to not be part of it. And the reason you don't have a choice is because it's a single body, it's a single entity, it's a superorganism, it's a mystical body. That's what I think lies behind all this. Now, to close, I suppose, this, one might say, well, where does this lead us? Certainly the challenge seems to be important. If what I'm saying is true, a couple things we can say. You can see, I hope, that the mystical body gives rise to the possibility of sovereignty. You can't be above a part and separate something unless the something is already there, right? At the same time, the sovereignty is necessary to keep together the mystical body so it doesn't break up into competing interests, right? And then when we get to Rousseau, the state becomes the expression of this in the real world. These things are all tied together. They're not separate things. This is something that I didn't really understand before I started doing this research. So this is all part of the same thing, right? You kind of have to confront the mystical body question, the implicit social contract question, if you're going to confront the state. They're not like cousins, they're like Siamese twins, historically. But of course, that raises the question of rhetorical strategy. How do you deal with this, right? Because if what I'm saying is true, and I don't know if it is or not, but if it's true, then I think it's not unrealistic to propose that this implicit social contract idea is not a metaphor for theology or a simile. It actually is theology. It actually is religion. And and people, we live in a rational time. It's all about science and reason. I don't know. Maybe not. Maybe in fact, our politics are in fact still deeply religious, and I can understand why that would be. But of course, back to the question of rhetorical strategy. How do you deal with that? Have you ever tried to talk anyone out of believing in God? That's usually work, right? So I don't think that. I'm not convinced that that's the right approach. And that used to be my approach, of trying to convince people, this thing doesn't exist if you're talking about it. Maybe that's not the right approach, That's, I don't know if that works. Anyways, these are my thoughts, and I was happy that you were here to listen to them and share them. Thank you.